Hello, my name is Phanphaka Rungruang from the Language Institute, Burapha University, Thailand. I will be presenting my research on the topic thread novel, affect and form in Dana Spiotta's Innocence and Others for the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Thammasat University's National and International Conference 2022. My presentation aims to demonstrate the connection between affect and form from my analysis of the thread structure of Dana Spiotta's 2016 novel, Innocence and Others. Specifically, I will elaborate on the following three main points in this presentation. First, I want to show you how locating the operation of affects in novels forms can make the renewed enthusiasm in formal analysis as part of the post-critical turn not regarded as just a flat description of a form that yields no real depth and insights. Second, I want to elaborate how the specificity of affects can make effective analysis despite its ambivalence in nature, a more productive approach in literary criticism. And the last point that I hope my presentation will demonstrate is how close reading becomes a useful mode of reading that gels formal and affective analysis together. So before we get into the thick of it, let's get to know the novel a little bit better and why I choose to conduct a study about it. Innocence and Others consists of two storylines. One follows the lives and careers of two female filmmakers, Meadow, who is an experimental documentarian, and Carrie, a successful mainstream filmmaker. Another storyline details the life of a chubby, partially blind telephone salesperson who is nicknamed Jelly after Jelly Donuts, who calls famous Hollywood men in the 80s under the pretense that she is a blonde and beautiful 20-something postgraduate student named Nicole, and her character is modeled after Miranda Grosswaner, a real catfisher from the 70s and 80s, who used to call famous men in real life, like Billy Joel. And both narrative strands here are told in parallel throughout the novel that oscillates between them. In one respect, it's possible to say that the two strands demonstrate formally side by side the similarity of two kinds of artists, a filmmaker as an artist in traditional sense and a catfisher as a con artist. And this comparison in the novel is also confirmed in Spiotta's interview with Josh Saunders when she said that her novel is about confidence artists, and she was inspired by the words of Orson Welles, especially his film F for Fake, to see artistic endeavor as a type of confidence game. And in the interviews, Spiotta also said that an important motive for novel is the idea of being a good liar because you feel that you have an eye on the higher truth, which is essentially making fiction somewhat like that. And Spiotta's statement here is quite significant in that she establishes clearly a connection between her own profession as a fiction writer with the motive of arts as a confidence game that she claims her novel is dealing with. And this makes me kind of curious and suspicious as to how Spiotta may have used her own novel to kind of reflect and form that relationship between herself and an artist, confidence artist, and the reader as the audience, victim. And this is an entry point into my inquiry into Innocence and Others. Basically, I want to know how the relationship between this novel and the reader is also built on the motives of us as a confidence game that is reflected on the pages of the novel itself. Following in this line of investigation, I arrive at a conclusion, which I'm presenting here today, that the motive of us as a confidence game is inherent in the way that the novel's thread produces an effective response from the reader, which in turn grants coherence back to the form of the novel, fundamentally making the reader an essential part of the form of the novel itself. In other words, I am arguing that the novel's thread structure produces affect in the form of anticipation, as they are waiting for a connection between the two narrative strands to connect before the novel betrays the reader's trust in a possibility of an eventual formal coherence by refusing to fulfill the reader's anticipation. And all of this is done in the service of making the reader having to engage with the text by means of what I would call recitative reading, so that the reader becomes an absolute essential part of the textual form. So basically, to tie my argument with the idea of us as a confidence game, we can say that the thread form tricks the reader into performing an effective level of reading by means of anticipation and regurgitation to make the reader a part of its form. The thread form that mirrors the motive of us as a confidence game dissolves the boundary between the novel as a textual object and the reader as a reading subject. I'm aware that there are many important terms here that I'm referring to: affective labor, regurgitative reading, etc., but I will unpack all these terms as we go along. And let's start by the most important term here, which is thread form. So what is a thread form, and how is it used in Spiotta's novel? Spiotta describes that she writes a novel using the thread form in a sense that there are two intertwined stories. However, she pushes the idea of a threaded shape further by, instead of having the two stories stay connected, they will only make a brief contact before breaking apart. In her words, like billiard balls that would connect and then grow apart. And yes, indeed, Meadow, Carrie, and Jill's stories converge only once in the novel, from around page 180 to page 200, basically over halfway through the only 280 page long novel, during which the reader learns that Jelly becomes a subject of one of Meadow's documentary films, which is called Inward Operator, which is about Jelly's telephone relationship as Nicole with Jack Cusano, a fictional famous film score composer. In those 20 pages, the reader also learns about the content of the film from the point of view of Carrie as a viewer, who is also a filmmaker. So she is able to see all the editing and directorial tricks that Meadow has used to portray Jelly in a way to cast her as a confidence artist. And after this brief moment of contact between two storylines, the stories sort of separate again, detailing how the lives of these three women unfold after the making and viewing of Inward Operator. And after that point, it almost seems like the reader will be finally rewarded and relieved of their burden of anticipation, because both storylines appear to move towards a part of reconciliation in their own way. All is good and well into the final chapter, when all of a sudden the reader gets to read the story of Sarah Mills, the fourth female character, who is an inmate convicted of manslaughter for leaving her infant child to die in a house fire. And Sarah Mills is a subject of Meadow's aborted film that becomes a turning point to prompt her to abandon her career as a filmmaker. So telling the story of Sarah Mills as the last chapter doesn't really make sense. Why Sarah Mills in those final pages, a name that is only mentioned in the passing, now becomes a full-fledged character that gets to have the final words. So with such an ending, Innocence and Others indeed leaves a loose thread, refusing the reader a sense of closure and satisfaction from finally making a full sense of the story after all the hard work that they have put in into understanding and making sense of the two threads together. And this complicated threaded structure of Innocence and Others, and the final loose thread that I just outlined, requires an effective labor to make sense of what the reader has read. And effective labor, by definition, is a form of immaterial labor that operates on the dynamic of affect that, upon encounters, one ought to affect and be affected by one another, leading to the production of a mutually affected assemblage sort of entity. Here, Ralph Clare had adopted that concept of affective labor to describe a process of reading. He calls it an affective labor of reading, which is a practice by which the reader has to work, to do work, to work through something when encountering a text, formal breaks, interruptions, recursions, and meta moments. The reader here, in my case, has to contribute their affective labor to make it possible for Spiotta's novel to have a coherent form after the novelist decides to end her novel like that. In this way, the reader is, becomes an essential part of the novel's form, because that's how the novel that's how the novel ends. There's nothing left after that. The reader has left to their own device to make sense of that loose thread hanging in the end. So without the reader's contribution of trying to make sense of it, the form of the novel will not hold. That's why the reader becomes a fundamental part of the novel's coherence itself. So I'm suggesting here that Spiotta's novel demands that the reader has to do a lot of work, a labor of reading to produce affect to make sense of the form. So the question here is, what kind of affect is the reader producing through that labor of reading? My answer is anticipation as a dominant form of affect that operates at the level of form in this novel. It's anticipation of a possible closure that is later left unfulfilled in the form of a trust betrayal. And this is where the motive of arts as a confidence game has come in. Confidence game is a matter of trust, right? The key of the confidence game is the confidence that the innocent endows to the other. And then it becomes a fraud or a liar because the trust is betrayed. And for the first 180 pages, the novel has promised the reader a convergence between two storylines. The stories have to somehow meet, otherwise it will not be a novel, but only just a collection of two short stories. The novel builds that expectation through its promise of being a novel and then rewards the reader at page 180 with that eventual narrative contact. Yes, the contact is brief, but how the stories unfold afterward is rewarding enough in the sense that they are offering that sense of closure and reconciliation. And everything is fine. There's a closure on the horizon until Sarah Mills' chapter at the end. The reader anticipation that had been fulfilled until that moment is now violently disrupted. Now they can no longer be satisfied. The anticipation turns into frustration that prompts a rethinking or possibly a rereading of the whole thing. So to understand how anticipation works through the form of Spiotta's novel, I think it's helpful to look at her description in this scene of the movement of the train that Meadow is trying to capture in one of her early films. Spiotta writes here that the way the rhythm gathered, the volume increased as the train grew closer. It created a train approaching that is its own suspense. Not suspense exactly, momentum intensified and created a need for satisfaction. The passing was a satisfying rush. You were in it, the longed for moment, the powerful mechanical thing speeding by and dwarfing you. It overwhelmed you. But even in the midst of it, you knew it would be over soon. The noise, the movement, the friction of metal on metal, it will all pass you by. The thread form of Spiotta's work moves in the dynamic that is not dissimilar to this imagery of a train approaching and arriving at the reader at the point of contact between the two strands of the story. However, to keep with this imagery of the arrival of a train, we can say that Sarah Mills' chapter represents another train that is arriving but never arrives. The feeling of anticipation is left unsatisfied here, and that is the affect that the form of innocence and others produces, the anticipation for something to happen. And you might notice that I am being quite specific with the kind of affect that is being produced here by the thread form of the novel. I call it anticipation, that feeling of excitement about something that is going to happen in the near future. And you can say it's quite odd that I name it, because by definition, affect is something that is not nameable, not codifiable, just a felt intensity, a force, potential. of something that is not yet happening. However, in this way, I see that anticipation is an excellent example of an affect because it describes that middle space of the known and the not yet known. With anticipation, you know something would happen, but you don't know what it is. And I specifically name anticipation here as the operational affect in Spiotta's novel for three reasons. First of all, it's precisely because anticipation works in such an exemplary way to help us see clearly what affect is. Second, without naming it, as you can see, it's impossible for me to describe the connection between affect and form and the novel's motive of arts as a confidence game, which leads me to the third and final reason, which is that I want to point out how affect needs to be specific in order for it to be worth something, to be operational. And here I'm joining a group of affect scholars who are recently arguing for the importance of being committed to specificity in reading effectively, or in other words, who are attempting to tie affect and form together. Eugene Brinkman is one of those scholars who argues this point quite poignantly, saying that if affect is conceived of as synonymous with force or as intensities or as the capacity for staging changes and movement as such, then it opens up very few theoretical avenues. Why turn to affect at all? But only reading specific affects at having and being bound up with specific forms gives us the vocabulary for articulating those many differences. In this way, Brinkman concludes that affect can be transformed into something that is not given in advance, not even apprehendable in advance, except through the thickets of formalist analysis, which is something that I hope to demonstrate through my reading of Spiotta's novel. However, it is Marnie Ritchie's analysis of disgust as a form of affect and her proposal of the practice of regurgitative reading that allows me to elaborate more fully the working of affects in Spiotta's novel. Regurgitative reading is an interpretative process that uses the act of chewing cud as an analogy for engaging with the affective excess that spills out from the text. According to Ritchie, apart from reading and gaining meaning from the text, reading also repeats on reader in that there is something that we never quite get from reading, something that we cannot fully assimilate from the authors and the voices that we encounter. That is what Ritchie calls affective excess from the text. And because there is that something incomprehensible that we cannot fully digest, we need to spill it out in order to chew it back in again. And this is what Ritchie calls regurgitative reading, a form of reading that takes the overflow of reading as an opportunity to think again, to read again, to begin again. It is an obsessive repetition of a reading process that is ongoing, revolving in the mind. Spiotta's loose thread in the end, in the final chapter, can be said to produce that excess that we cannot assimilate, that urges us to regurgitate and chew back what we have read. It forces us to think again, to read again, and to begin again. However, what is even more important about Ritchie's regurgitative reading to my analysis is that it is an example of how a formal operation is a dynamic, affective movement. Ritchie emphasizes the oscillation in the process of regurgitation, that process that happens in a loop of eating something, chewing something, regurgitate back, and chewing it again. In writing and reading a thread form, a similar process of repeated regurgitation is also happening to the reader and the writer herself, according to Spiotta. In writing the novel, she claims that when asked if she writes both storylines separately before intertwining them, she claims that she writes in the order that we see, which is not temporally linear. And to be able to do so, she said that she had to reread what she had written so far before she could continue from where she had left off. And she had to do this every time obsessively in a repetition when she wrote the novel. Similarly, the novel has to perform a similar kind of regurgitative reading in following the thread of the novel that oscillates between the two strands. While they're reading one strand, they have to keep the other strand at the back of their mind. And when they oscillate back to the previous strand, they have to regurgitate what they have held in their mind back out to understand it. And this process keeps going throughout the novel. Moreover, I call anticipation as a specific form of affect in Spiotta's novel, and people may say that any form of reading entails anticipation as an affective force. It's true, but in the thread form that I just described, the reader is also forced to work harder. The reader has to work through regurgitating those two strands in a constant loop to connect them together to anticipate that eventual moment of contact. And in the end, the novel betrays them by forcing them to do all the work over again to regurgitate back what they have eaten because of the loose end as a final chapter. The novel betrays the reader's trust in order to force them one final time to do the hardest work of assimilating the final part in the overall narrative of the novel. So it's important that the novel has to end this way. With such an ending, Spiotta is able to articulate her motive of art as a confidence game through the form itself. And moreover, the novel's ending is able to produce the final and more powerful affect of unfulfilled anticipation to force the reader to go back to the novel and to try to make sense of it, to incorporate the final loose strand. It's ultimately a demonstration of how a form can produce affective responses in the reader in such a powerful way that it can articulate, it can reflect not only the motives of the novel, but also making the reader an absolute essential fundamental part of its own form. And with regurgitative reading, we can see how a relationship between forms and affects also reaffirms the significance of close reading as an approach that is needed to, to name specificity of affects that operates through the form and as an approach that is prescribed to the reader from the operation of such affects in the form. To conclude, we can see how looking at form, we can specify, understand the productive work of affects, which in this case, it was to help reflect the motive of the novel. So to repeat the words of Rungruang here again, I hope that I have shown that affects can be transformed into something not given in advance, not apprehendable, except through the thickest formalist analysis. And this is quite important with the renewed commitment to form in the postmodern, post-critical affective turn, which is being seen as being too flat, not rigorous enough in the insight that it produces by means of only tracing and describing a form. Here, we trace and follow the form of the novel, and we discover a thread that produces anticipation as affect, and how that affective relationship yields meaning and coherence back into the form of the novel. It's no longer a flat approach, but a highly dynamic and productive method of engaging with a piece of text. The turn to form in the postmodern time here, you can say that it's part of a disavowal of the contentious criticism in favor of connections, movements, networks, relations. Formal analysis in the post-critical time is an act of tracing those connections and movements to gain understanding of the world. Yes, it's risk being accused of lacking depth and liquor, but I hope to show here that by identifying the work of a specific form of affect in the novel structure through an approach of close reading. It can give us, it can help us see how formal analysis and effective analysis has that power to produce knowledge that is equally constructive and insightful. And that is the wrap of my presentation. And here is the list of all the texts that I have consulted in my research of this topic. Thank you so much for listening.